Hello, everyone. Happy Thursday. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Sarah Siegel, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am delighted to welcome you to tonight's event with Deirdre McNamer discussing her latest novel, Aviary. She is joined in conversation tonight by Andrew Martin. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these challenging times. Every week, we're hosting events here on Zoom, and as always, our event schedule appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and browse our shelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question at any time during the talk today, go to the Q&A button on your screen and we'll get through as many as time allows. If you would like to buy a copy of Aviary, there will be a link in the chat where you can purchase it. All sales to this link support Harvard Bookstore, so thank you for your support of community spaces like your local bookstore. There will also be a link to donate in the chat if you would like to give additional support to Harvard Bookstore. Your purchases and financial contributions make this virtual author series possible and now more than ever supports the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you for tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings this past year, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And now I am so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Deirdre McNamer is the author of 5 novels: Aviary, Rima in the Weeds, One Sweet Quarrel, My Russian, and Red Rover, which was a winner of the Montana Book Award and was named a Best Book of the Year by Artforum, The Washington Post, and The Los Angeles Times. She is joined tonight by Andrew Martin, whose first novel, Early Work, was a New York Times Notable Book of 2018 and a finalist for the Cable First Novelist Award. His stories and essays have been published in the Paris Review, the New York Review of Books, Harper's, and T, the New York Times style magazine. Tonight, they are discussing Aviary, a masterful exploration of the rich and hidden facets of human character as illuminated by the mysterious connections among the residents of the senior residence in Montana. At the deteriorating Pheasant Run, the occupants keep their secrets and sadnesses locked tight behind closed apartment doors. When a fire breaks out, the city's chief fire inspector is called to investigate and finds himself learning more than expected about human nature and about personal and corporate greed as it is visited upon the vulnerable. Beautifully written and long awaited from a writer who Chicago Tribune notes writes with extraordinary emotional acuity and with a keen sense of the small detail that says it all, Aviary weaves a compelling tapestry of crisis, grief, and the mysteries of memory and old age. Without further ado, I will turn things over to our speakers. Deirdre and Andrew, the virtual podium is yours.
Hello. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. And Andrew and I are just going to start off with, we met in Missoula, where I was teaching at the University of Montana. Andrew was in the MFA program here. And his first 2 books are largely based in Missoula and have an exceptionally funny, sharp take on the place, which I remembered again when I was looking at No Cops, one of his stories in Cool for America. And this sentence just cracked me up. Like many of the men she knew in Missoula, he was a dog trainer, novelist, and organic grocery store employee. It is just that, like many of the men she knew in Missoula. So I had Missoula on the mind, and we had agreed that I would read briefly from this novel. So I'm just going to start right out doing that. Really short, couple of pages. But it's the fire inspector in this book, Lander Mackey, is driving over to the site of a potential arson over in the university area. And it's just him. He's a rather eccentric guy, and he's just wending his way in his 1972 Volvo that he got on Craigslist. That is like a big clunking slow machine, and he drives it as even slower than anybody else in the world would. so he looks at things closely. Shortly after the dispatcher's call, Mackie drove in his customary manner toward Pheasant Run. That's the old people's place, which meant that it took him quite a long time to cover the 2 miles. He liked to remind himself as he drove that the Volvo moved along the floor of an ancient lake, stupendously large, and that the mountains that began at the edge of the houses still bore the watermarks of that lake's levels during several glacial dramas that had drained and refilled the valley time after time. Mountains as ancient shores. He found the idea oddly comforting. And I'm just skipping ahead a little bit. Down on the floor of the Great Lake, of the Ghost Lake, Mackie's little city was a place where vivid bicyclists zoomed the streets, harrying winds were mostly absent. Summer brought flourishing trees and flowers, independent bookstores thrived, and waitresses had master's degrees. Vigorous exercise and modest feats of physical daring were applauded. Hang gliders rose off the mountaintops and wafted like old music through the air. Mackie found himself appreciating deeply the salubrious qualities of the place and its surrounding physical grandeur. The encircling mountains, part forest, part scrub grass, and the way they rose into the broad sky like protectors and sentinels. But he also reminded himself to guard against enshrining it all, tempting though that was. After all, how perilously close the lively farmers' markets were to movie sets of idyllic overflowingness and goodwill. How monochromatic the handsome and tall young people. How full of misplaced zest the summer band laboring agriculturally in the river park. It was a place with such easeful surfaces that you had to work a little to see the warts, never mind the threats and the out and out griefs, the sort that had to play a part in the suicide rates, nearly the highest in the nation of both the pretty valley and the grand broad-shouldered state. Well, there were always recumbent bicyclists as antidotes to the adamant pleasantness. A grim-faced man in top-to-toe, sweat-wicking garments in bright colors pulled up beside the Volvo in a reclining position. These bicycles gave Mackie the creeps. They were so joyless and passive-aggressive, the rider leaning back from the experience, watching his legs work. His tailbone ached just looking at the guy. The only time it ached more was when a recumbent bicyclist was attached to a baby carrier on wheels, rare admittedly, but he'd seen it. And then the ache was combined with a certain quiet rage. There they were, adult and babe, moving 2 feet off the ground through tall herds of fast and heedless cars and trucks. It was the most witless embodiment of hippie holiness and outright stupidity he'd ever seen. No wonder I indulge modestly in pot, Mackie thought when he saw something like that. It's the only thing that assures me that I don't have to do anything. These people just are. However, conclusions like that were also the reason he was thinking of foregoing weed altogether. They just are. What a moronic rationale for bad behavior. It was the intellectual equivalent of predestination. The sun had lifted fully over the valley, and the tawny parts of the mountainsides lit up like lions. Something about the light now made every glimpse of red take on an aspect of indelibility. The bandana around that golden retriever's neck, its owner's hoodie, a scrim of maroon leaves on that Japanese maple, the fixed eternity of that stop sign. The redness also evoked flames, of course, and the case at hand. Okay, so that's him heading on. So I'm turning it over to Andrew now for a minute.
Oh, I love that passage so much. And I feel like I don't know, it's such a great encapsulation of what the book does so well, which is moving between this sort of like rich lyrical language, but then also into the sort of real, I don't know, gritty everydayness of the reclining bicyclist and the, I don't know, the I found myself listening to the first half thinking, oh my God, I wish I was back in Missoula, this like utopian, beautiful paradise. And then you do such a nice job of turning it so that we see that it's not all perfect. But I wanted to talk to start with about the city of Missoula and the place, and how it, I don't know, what it has done for you as a writer, and how you think about it, and thinking also about sort of exactly what the passage is grappling with, which is this sort of like idea we have of the Mountain West and this sort of mythos of it versus the reality of it, and how those things combine. And I wondered how you deal with that in your work.
Um, well, I'll just start with something that I found when I was teaching. I retired in June from the University of Montana, and students, I often asked students, why they had come here and what the experience was turning out to be for them, and so on. And a repeated answer was, I wanted someplace that felt removed, and where I could just focus on writing and not worry too much about advancing my career or making the right contacts or whatever. And also maybe in some cases just being away from urban life. And it does have this very sheltering feel. There's mountains all the way around. It takes you 9 hours to drive to Portland, 9 hours to drive to Seattle or Salt Lake or the Twin Cities even further, so it's really out here. And that has been for me, I, I, I moved to the coast, the West Coast in my mid-20s and worked there for several years, and came back here just because I needed a job and there was one open at the newspaper. And I found that I have stayed ever since. So this was like 1978. The secret of living here or a place like this, I think, is you have to get out and go other places. But there is also remains, for me anyway, a, a sense that I'm in a place where, first of all, maybe it's just the people that I run into all the time, but there are a lot of serious readers and writers here, and that matters to me because, and it's not a dilettantish writer town. You don't go here and sort of, talk more about, being a writer than you actually write. And so there was always the sense that I always knew other people were out there on a given day, maybe a day when I was having a hard time writing anything I could even look at, knowing that other people who were more published than I and very serious about it and having their own financial struggles and other kinds of struggles were sitting there in their rooms doing it at the same time.
Yeah.
And so that is one aspect of it. It's also just crummy winters, and you can't go out, it's just not even picturesque in the winter. It's just a big low ceiling. And because it's in a valley, there are these inversions. But for about 4 or 5 months every year, it's really kind of a lovely place to be. And it's different. It's the university town, the liberal arts university town, or used to be. And it's like Madison or Eugene or that Cornell, Ithaca, and
Yeah.
more than it is like the rest of the state, actually. So in that way, it's even removed from its own state.
It is, but it's funny because I feel like what you draw on in this book, especially, is that sense of this community full of these characters and this sort of closed community in a way. And I feel like that's really like an interesting part of what's going on in this book, is all these people are sort of connected to each other, in a way that if you were writing about, a big city, I think it would be harder to have these organic connections. I think that's what I found so inspiring about
Mhm.
it as a place to write about, is because you can sort of have those things that fiction requires, where you have people running into each other and people knowing
Right.
things about each other's lives. And I think
Mhm.
that's like such an important, it's not the wide, right, as you said, it's not the wide open plains of the John Ford movies. It's a different kind of West, of
Right, it
community.
is. And I'm really responding to what you say about it has literary aspect. It kind of helps in the thinking about stories because things that seem really coincidental, meetings between people who haven't seen each other for 40 years or something, happen all the time in Montana. I mean, there aren't very many people in Montana. I think it's like the population of, I had it written down here somewhere, but it's like 6 people per square mile on average, compared to 90 something for the rest of the country. Um, and the strangest things happened because, well, just here's one example of this sort of semi-literary fodder that comes from the way things are organized or exist here. When my parents were living in an apartment building not far from ours, and getting old and declining, and my dad's memory was really, really going. He gave me his war diary to look at World War II, and um, in it, he had been on leave. He was on Saipan. He was a B-29 bomber pilot. And he had a leave to come to Missoula, where he had started school as a small town kid from Shelby, Montana. When a couple of years went off to the war, but he came here on leave, and he said, I've been giving the rush to Virginia so-and-so, giving the rush to, and she had an odd, distinctive last name. So I was reading through this, and I saw one day on the roster of the apartment building that last name. And it turned out that this person was living a floor below my father, and had been married 60 or 65 years to a guy who was old and dying. And I don't, and my dad's memory was pretty much gone, but he kept a kind of courtliness about him. And so in the elevator, if there were other people from the building in there, he would, Gene just kind of greet the ladies and tell them how lovely they looked that day and so on. And I'm sure at one time, one of them was probably this Virginia, may or may not have known who he was, and he certainly didn't know who she was. But, 6 decades earlier, they had been dating and going out, a couple of blocks from where they were living. And so here it's kind of like Nabokov talks about, he doesn't really believe in time except as a kind of magic carpet where that he when he gets off of his magic carpet, he folds it in such a way that the patterns lie on top of each other. And that's how he thinks of time. And when I realized that sort of thing was happening in this building, it just makes you think of stories. What happened in between, what was their relationship like? What is it like when your head's emptied out and you can't even make a flicker of a connection with something that was very important to you at a very dramatic time of your life.
Right. And that seems to be so deeply embedded in what this book is about in some ways. I don't know which direction I want to go first, but one is um, this question that you're talking about of time and sort of time folded on itself does seem to be something that's happening constantly, because you've got characters who are losing their memories, or who are sort of like living both in the past and the present in some way. And you have a very young character sort of strikes up a relationship with a very old character. You have this sense of sort of time circling in on itself in a way. And I wondered how you managed that and thought about it as you were developing the book, and I guess how conscious you were of these timelines and patterns, or how much you sort of followed them organically and then tried to shape them, or how that all worked.
Yeah, I'm very conscious of
Taught a
them.
whole class about it, though.
Yeah, right. I mean, I've taught a class called Time and Trouble, and I'm pretty much obsessed with time and trouble. But I think that your question does speak to how you get that onto the page in a way that it doesn't confuse the reader unduly, that seems like it's plausible, and but doesn't let the reader really stray away from the story that you're trying to tell, because it seems to be all over the place in time. Folded time is a lot of kinds of time. And so I was thinking about that today. And I think that when you have a lot of characters and they're remembering, and there's just a lot of time periods to consider, that it's probably a good idea to have a rather constricted geology of the story. That I mean, in this book, they are all living in the same building in a modestly sized little city, and so you can keep bringing them back to the locale, and that I think that grounds the reader somewhat, and also probably a fairly narrow real time, present time is helpful. The actual real time, present time events in this book cover only a span of maybe 3 or 4 months, and then jump forward about a little more than a year at the very end. But is that kind of part of what you were thinking about, is how you manage all of that?
Yeah, absolutely. But the way you're describing it also makes me think about something I think about a lot, because I feel like I have an average time of about a year from when I start a short story to finishing it, or probably much longer. And this, I don't know how long this book took from initial idea to completion, but I think a long time. And I wonder, I don't know, about that feeling that I sometimes have of like, my God, I've spent more time in this room than these characters will ever spend in this room. It took me like 2 years to get characters to spend 20 minutes. I don't know, it sort of gives you that feeling of this compressed, and I wonder, how does a book change over that time that you're working on it, when you're writing about a relatively compressed time period? How does that change the way that how does the time you spend on it change the book itself?
Well, I've come to realize that you need to factor in my case, I'm a slow writer. And so this book took a very long time to write. But my other ones were always 5 or 6 years too, and so I think I've come to just accept that I'm going to change over that time during the writing of the book. And it will probably be reflected in what gets to the page. In the case of Aviary, and I tell these long time stories as an attempt to console people who are working really long on something, because I think it at first blush can just seem sort of appalling to spend that much time on one project. But what happened in this case was that I worked for 3 years on another novel before after the publication of my last novel. I turned to something else, worked on it for 3 years, realized that it wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't, I couldn't seem to make it gain purchase, either with me or with it among the elements themselves. And so I gave it up. And then I started this book thinking to write a comic mystery. with quirky, dark undertones. That was my idea.
That's
And
Netflix description.
and I'm actually not a very good mystery writer in terms, there are so many people out there who can write a conventional, whodunit, who is just so clever about the red herrings and the whole, everything that you have to do to write one classically well. But I wanted to try to do that. And also, this was a time when I was visiting a place not unlike Pheasant Run. It was in much better shape, and it was where my parents lived. But I was in an elderly person's environment, and dealing with the fact that I was going to be losing my parents pretty soon, and there was more and more care going on, and so on. So I think the comic part was I was trying to distract myself and buffer myself from actually what was happening in my life. And so I'd write a little section here, and I was making kind of merciless fun of various characters that I was making up, just to kind of make myself laugh and, take out a little aggression, all the those reasons. But
On the poor
ultimately,
cyclists.
what happened was I began to be more interested. I got interested enough in my characters and invested enough in them that their bigger mysteries started to take over. And I kept the sort of classical kind of mystery going, but bigger ones started to come in and take up more of the book. They just jostled with the plan quite a bit. And I think that coincided with the time when I was just really wanting to think about more about what that last kind of run in your life can be and what it can mean. And I had changed by then, is my point, so I was writing a different kind of book by then. But then I had to kind of match all the different tone changes, which were just all over the place, and make it cohere tonally. And that was another whole phase of the book. Was it this kind of jokey mystery, or was it, a much more somber investigation? And it just didn't really find its cohesion among the parts, for yet another long period of time.
But I just love that feeling as you read it, that it feels organic as you move through the book, that, okay, I'm seeing something and I see the sort of pieces being put in place for this mystery. But then, as you wrote to me in an email, you said there's mysteries lowercase and there's mysteries uppercase. And that feels to me like the tunnel you go through as you read the book, that you realize that there is, I don't know, somehow you really managed to transcribe that feeling of it going from something that feels more structured to something that is much more open-ended, in this really beautiful way, like the way that a day feels or a life feels, where you think one thing is going to happen, and then you're surprised genuinely. And I feel like you can feel your own surprise as a writer on the page almost, like finding new light in these characters and finding hope.
Well,
I mean, it's such a
you
hopeful
helped
book.
me think about that. You really helped me think about that, because in an earlier email, you mentioned Evelyn Waugh's A Handful of Dust, which I had somehow not read. And so I read it, and something similar goes on there, where you think you're reading about a certain class of Brits between the war, and the tone is, they're kind of dallying around, and it's kind of snarky, and it's wry, but it felt to me like a comedy of manners more than anything else. It goes along like that. And then a big, sad, hard thing happens. The son of one of the couples is shockingly and suddenly killed. And then from there on, it's all on another plane. And I just found that fascinating to that I stayed with it, after having been disarmed in some ways by the front end of it, where you're
Yeah.
just kind of watching these people be kind of earnest and ridiculous, and then all of a sudden, like, the big mysteries are there.
Yeah.
Not who's going to sleep with who, or who's going to lose their money, or
Those aren't the big mysteries. No.
oh, they're pretty big.
But the humor, it's funny because the book is funny, and we wanted to talk about humor as well, because it is, I mean, you have a few characters who feel like they're straight out of like a modern version of Dickens, like Herbie Bonebright is maybe the best name possible for this like lunk-headed building manager, and he feels like sort of one of like a gargoyle almost. And you can be merciless with him. And then other characters, I feel like they're much, you're gentler with them. And even Herbie has his, I don't know, moments, I think. They're all three-dimensional. And all, you have all these, you show your characters, you're not overly sentimental about having these elderly characters be vain and be sort of snippy with each other and difficult with each other and all these things. And so I wondered, I don't know, what was important about keeping the humor throughout, even as the sort of model changed, even as your idea of what the book was changed.
Well, you a certain kind of humor runs through both of your really good books, and it's a defining characteristic of them. And for me, I was reminded of that again just recently, rereading them, and I did try to think about what is there are different kinds of humor, obviously. There's there can be a kind of armored humor, which is sort of the writer using characters and situations to sort of mock and satirize, and but it's the writer is really sort of in the driver's seat there. But if you can kind of upend that hierarchy a little bit, if you allow a kind of what is it? The kind of humor that can surprise even the writer, if you know a character well enough, that a character will sort of come through with some odd way of behaving or saying something that is funny, and that possibly the writer didn't even intend to make funny. There's a kind of a fluidity that can come into the depiction of a character in which a certain sort of humor is part of. And I think humor is it airs things out. It lets you laugh. It does not exclude. It doesn't exclude real sorrow. And so, I welcome it when I read it in other people's work, and I try to be ready for it to happen in almost anything I'm writing. It makes me feel more affectionate toward the characters. It makes me feel more tolerant of all of us in a way. It's just a great. If it's not used strategically, if it just is allowed to sort of become part of the fabric of a depiction of human beings, then I just think it only adds to most stories.
I was just imagining you, I was like, you could not have been not laughing during the scenes with the animal ESP going on. But there's also just this like there's a real poignancy to it, right? The like, to these moments of, I don't know, even when it's wacky, it's always grounded in character. That seems to be what you're saying, I think, on some level, that it's right, that it's always grounded in like actual human behavior and in the moment, rather than just sort of, it never feels shoehorned in, right? Like, here, I'm going to get a joke in, and I think that organic quality is so essential.
I do too. And, I remember Penelope Gilead, who wrote for the New Yorker some years ago, did a wonderful profile of John Cleese, and in which she tried to define humor. It's very hard to define, but for her, and I hope I don't get this wrong, but it was close to this. She saw it as great energy expended on things that don't matter. Energy expended on the tangential. And I started thinking about that, and it really is a kind of a staple of humor, I think, is feverish attention to something that in the larger scheme of things might not seem to matter. And so it's very closely related to obsession, and so on. And, your characters in your books are really endearing for that reason, because, they're so armored with a certain kind of irony that they're totally available to the reader. It's a kind of, they give themselves away with their energetic insistence on things that don't matter. Something, not always, but it's just kind of instantly funny and endearing, I think. Do you think there's anything to that? Do you see it that way?
I do. I find them endearing. And I really responded to what you said at the beginning of this response about being surprised by what ends up being funny that the characters say. I used to think people were kind of bullshitting when they would talk about like, oh, I let the characters talk and like see what happens. But I think when you're really in the groove, it's like you kind of see the conversation playing out and you just sort of like try to follow it like you would a conversation, at a party or something. And then like, even if you thought this was a character who was serious, you zoom out and you're like, oh my gosh, this guy's being totally ridiculous and is like, delivering a monologue about whatever, how he used to be a middle school teacher, but then, now did too many drugs and is whatever. And you're kind of like suddenly discovering the character by listening to them talk rather than by sort of forcing them to do things,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, let them run.
But I wanted, before we've got some questions in the box, so I want to ask one more question that we had talked about a little bit before we get to some of the box Q&A questions, which was, I think it's a fitting thing to sort of end our bit on, is the question of sentiment and the question of sentimentality versus just emotionality. And we were both remembering Bill Kittredge, the great Montana writer and teacher, who would talk about the difference between sentiment, or what sentimentality was. And I wondered how you thought about that, dealing with these things that, as you said, were so close to your own maybe memories of this apartment with your parents, and also just dealing with all this like kind of heavy stuff and things that really can invoke sappiness or overwriting, and you never do that. And I wonder how you think about these things.
Well, it was interesting. It's a kind of a tricky notion what sentimentality is. I looked in Wikipedia or something, and it was like somebody's first definition of it was that it was a display of excessive emotion, which doesn't actually seem on the mark to me at all. I think it's closer to what Bill Kittredge told us all, which was that it is unearned, unearned emotion. And I think the unearned he was applying to the writer. So the writer talks about, a sentimental writer thinks that, intense and rather simple descriptions of a character's emotion or their situation is enough to produce some sense of identification in the reader, that you can just say, oh, she felt that if she listened to him 1 second longer, her heart would shatter into 1,000 pieces, something like that, some big slamming emotion. when the writer has, in many of those cases, not done the work to create a dramatic situation or believable characters who would be experiencing really powerful emotion, they just lay it on with the language. And so I think that's one kind of, that's one reason why sentimentality it is to be avoided. I have a horror of it, really. It's also kind of coercive on the part of the writer. It's like, you're going to feel this way, and it's sloppy. It's just sloppy. And but Kittredge also said another thing, which was that if you don't at least risk sentimentality when you're writing, you're never going to get to where you might want to go emotionally with a story. So you have to, I guess, get yourself into a realm when you're writing where you might wonder if you're being sentimental or not, and whether you should be pulling it back. But that same piece of writing might also be going in a direction that is finally going to end up being earned and true.
Right, because if you don't engage the questions of life and death, and the great love of your life, and whatever these things that are the things of life, you're only gonna skate on the surface. But I, for one, have found myself at times so afraid of being sentimental that it's like better to stay with, better to stay with the party chat, But then it's
you
like,
feel like you're like the person weeping at the Verizon ad on TV, it's like, it's like a failure of being in real touch with real things. But as you say, you don't want to overguard yourself from that to the point that you miss what's most important emotionally in what you're trying to talk about.
right, because I think like cynicism is probably a worse sin, if we're figuring out the circles of writerly sin. I feel like cynicism might be worse than sentimentality. Or maybe they occupy places next to each other, and I don't know.
Well, and it's easy. Cynicism
Right.
is easy. It's very, and if characters or define themselves by what they're against only, then they end up being thin characters. Usually it's just easy to do that. It's harder to try to find out what you're really about, what,
Yeah.
character.
I want to get into some of the questions we have. We have one from Karen, who we answered her first question, but she has another different question. She says, "Hi Dee, this is Karen. I'm so happy to see this novel," Karen with a C. "I'm so happy to see this novel and to see you. Much love. Dee, amidst its comic tones and sweet synchronicities, Aviary is completely eviscerating in its sizing up of how our medical industrial complex treats elders. And so much of us carry this despair of wrangling with Medicare, of the kinds of choices we have to make for parents, others, ourselves. I wonder, what is your prayer for growing old in America? Not saying you need to solve this mess, but in spending all this time thinking and writing about being elderly and at the mercy of this system, what have been some of your insights, hopes, and prayers for the possibilities inside end-of-life experience?"
Oh, that's a really good question. Well, I think it's not news to any of us that the quite old are one of this country's shames, the way that we treat them. And just in terms of, even sort of benign paternalism, or just the kind of head patting that can go on, the way that your value as a person is just assumed to be less and less as you age, and that you're taken less and less seriously. And when you get into the politics and the economics of care for the aged in this country, we certainly have seen sort of enlarged by the pandemic, possibly, but that a lot of people, money is being made off them, big money. and that is just a social sin. It's a mortal sin. And
Worse
we
than a
need to
literary
do
sin.
something about it. What?
It's worse than a literary sin.
Right, right. So yeah, and then of course, I'm verging on it now. I mean, when you start to sort of see it with insight, you go, well, what would be the, ideal humane way to be old and, valued, like, ideally, in this society. And I think that it's just going to take, I'm a boomer, and there's a whole bunch of us now coming over the horizon, wondering how we're going to be treated in not so many years. And so maybe just the sheer numbers of people being worried about it will change the conditions on the ground a little bit. But it's just, in this country right now, it just seems so clear that if you occupy a position on the margins in any sort of way, um, there are many people quite willing to just throw you under the bus. And so I think, no, I can't fix it, but I'm sure thinking about it. And I think, becoming aware of how other countries and societies have dealt with their older people could be one kind of start to that. And becoming aware of scams. I mean, these phone calls that I get now, where I can imagine myself as an 85-year-old being told that my bank account is, that I should hand over the last of my savings for some reason. It's just, there's just really big bad stuff happening out there.
Yeah. Well, and you treat the characters in the book with such, I mean, it's a deserved dignity that should be taken for granted, but it's not so often
Right.
in both writing and reality. And I feel like that's one of the real strengths of the book. We have a question. Someone asks, can you talk about why you chose birds as a theme in Aviary?
Well, I think at one point my dad said something like, there's a lot of strange birds in this building. No, I'm not sure, but, and also just rare birds, that's a term for, just kind of exceptional types of people that come along every now and then. So it's kind of a compliment. But also the idea of an aviary, they're threatened species often that are in actual aviaries. And so it's keeping threatened birds safe but confined, and really, really apart from anything that resembles their natural element, even if it's made to seem like their natural element. And so it seemed to me that was an apt way to make a connection between sort of confinement and the conditions of old age. And then once I sort of just got going on that line, there just seemed to be birds flying all over the place, from falcon cars to, girlfriends named Raven, and
I hadn't made that connection until just now.
So I didn't hold back. Whenever a bird made itself felt, I let it be on the page.
I love it. I'm always envious of my friends who can identify all the birds when we go to the park, because I'm just like, oh, there's a big one, there's a little one.
That's a funny little cheep.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good one. It's a cute bird. We have a question. Now that the book is published, is there anything you wish you could go back and add in?
Well, interestingly enough, I did go back at the last minute and add in a tiny little thing, which turned out to kind of flip the whole, to solidify it for me. There had been, I had originally ended the book with a section just called We Fly Away. And it was sort of Cassie McMacken, the central female character, sort of coming to terms with where she was and how much she wanted to go on with her life and so on. But there also were sections in the book and characters in the book who had this sense of dread of something big at the door. There's a lion at the door. There's Rhonda, the animal communicator, said the birds are upset. The birds are, and that was in there. And then when I was doing the very last tweaks to it, the pandemic showed up. And I didn't want to write directly about that, but I just changed that section title to February 23rd or whatever it was, 2020, and had a person in the building recently returned from a Mexican cruise and with a cough, basically. I hope I did, I tried to keep it very understated, but it made me feel very spooked and kind of eerie because I felt at that point, as kind of silly as it sounds, but that the book knew more than I did. When I looked back at those places, there was just kind of dread, like big dread, that everything's turning. And I thought it might have just been, I don't know what I thought it was, but it was there. And it seemed that last adding in thing explained my own sort of subterranean dread in some way.
I felt a real genuine chill. I know it's a cliche, but I felt it when I read that, when I flipped the page to the date. And we've got these characters who we've come to know and love in a nursing home, and it's February 2020. I really felt like the absolute, like, oh God, of course, that's like
You
where.
never know what precipice you're on. I thought they were, when I finished it the first time, I thought they were on the precipice of almost dying, being old and dying. And then there was this new precipice, and that was so much more encompassing. Gave me the chills too.
It's funny, just a brief, I had a similar experience when I was correcting the galleys for early work. A lot of it takes place in Charlottesville, Virginia, and the galleys were due back, like, I don't know, I don't remember the exact date, August 11th, and the Charlottesville rally of the right-wing maniacs was like on August 9th. And I felt like I had to, I managed to get in a brief reference to that was going to be in the future of these, of these characters, was like, the tear gas was in their future. Basically, I managed to slip it in because it was also like, this is a book about a precipice. It turns out, like we're often writing about being on the edge of whatever's, we can't see what's coming next, the history that's coming next. We have, we've got so many more questions, and now some from some old friends. We have Sean Cleary asking, hey, Dee and Andrew, great to see you guys. How do you manage the big mystery, uppercase, and the little mystery in a mystery novel or just any novel? Do you think the big M mystery should sneak in or build, or should you see it from the beginning?
Probably you might want to see it at the beginning, but you're not going to. I mean, that's when it takes a lot of just sitting with characters you've made up and coming to know them, I think, to imagine what the big mysteries might be for them, or your own that you're transferring to them in some ways. So at least in my case, it was easier to start with a little mystery and work into the big mystery.
Yeah. We have Sean McDermott, the other Sean. We have both Seans in the house tonight, which is
Butte, America.
Pretty amazing. Sean is in Spokane.
Oh.
And she says, you mentioned spending a lot of time writing your books. How do you balance keeping your work tightly controlled without feeling like it's been overworked? Excited to read the new one in Spokane.
Oh, my books aren't tightly controlled, I think. I do this kind of type A thing every now and then of like, I'm so anxious about what I'm working on and how it isn't going anywhere sometimes that I'll make a big fancy outline. And then I try to follow the outline just so that I feel that I'm getting down the road. And then I stray from it. I get impatient with the outline and go back to a kind of playing in the sandbox mode. So it's very all over the place. And uh, I guess I don't really try to keep it tightly controlled anymore too much.
Yeah.
What I'll do is just break it down. That's what helps me more than kind of whipping it into shape, but just go, well, just do this scene, or just when I'm really stuck, sometimes I'll just go back and make sentences better if I can. And I'm a real believer that when you do that, when you start working with the form, the actual words and the way they're put together and where the pauses are and so on, you affect the content. Sometimes that's the way. You shake it up a little bit, you do a bend a word, you rearrange a sentence, speed it up, slow it down. And that can sometimes just kind of push a curtain back and you see better where the story wants to go.
That's such a good response because I feel like, right, it's the mechanics of the work itself can do. I don't know. I sometimes forget that it's all nuts and bolts. Like it's all nuts and bolts. The whole thing is made out of words. And if the words don't work, then the content's not going to follow. Like
Well, I think so, and I think sometimes all of us, when we're feeling pressured, we tend to rush it and kind of use sentences as train cars, as just kind of conveyance for the story, get it down the road, and rather than as entities in themselves that you can change and alter, and that oddly that can change the content.
Yeah.
You alter the form, you change the content.
And that's one very last question because we're almost at the very brink of the end here. But I wanted John Whiston asks,
Oh, John.
given your dad's memory loss, how did you manage this issue with your characters as you wrote about that?
Let's see. Well, it's interesting what survives in memory loss. My dad didn't have classic Alzheimer's, but he had dementia, and it was a good thing. I mean, I was very grateful that his personality didn't take a big turn, but things just started going away. And I was amazed at what stayed for a long time. Like one time when I was writing my last novel, I asked him how he had been in a very close call with his bomber in the war and had to land really fast with a shot up plane on Saipan. And I asked him how he did that. And he was well into not remembering lots of things by then, but he could tell me every single step, what you did with your feet, how you tried to side slip down like you went on skis, side slip down the sky really fast, land on one wheel, and that made me see that, or, remember again, if I didn't need to be reminded, that moments in your life are in which you are really on an edge of some kind, stay a long, long time. That was interesting to me. It's not just a clean sweep. And also just how to stay kind of decent and holding on to some courage while you feel that happening to you. That was very instructive to me, and I can only hope that I could muster as much kind of grace as he did. He knew what was going on.
Yeah. Oh, well, you captured it. I mean, I don't know. You captured it so beautifully. It's that feeling, that like in and out. I don't know. It's so clear, the writing in the book, and I don't know. It's just such an accomplishment. I'm just so grateful to you for writing it, and I don't know, having it out in the world. It's an incredible achievement. So thank you.
Well, I had my grave doubts that it would ever get out into the world, so it's kind of fun for me too.
Yeah.
And it's always fun to talk with you, Andrew. I want you to get out here to Montana this summer, and if possible, and
I would love to. I'm really
bring
hoping you will.
Laura, and we'll go to the Union Club and we'll have a beer.
Yeah, just one. Thank you, Dee. This was so fun. Thanks for asking me to do it.
Thank you both so much, Deirdre and Andrew, for your time. And thank you all for tuning in and showing up for authors, publishers, indie book selling, and our incredible staff here at Harvard Bookstore. If you would like to support Deirdre and the bookstore, please click on the link in the chat to purchase Aviary. We sincerely appreciate your support. Thank you all so much and have a great night, everyone.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.